Well, thank you. Before I get into telling you what I'm going to do, I'd like to know a little bit more about you guys. And the usual way of doing this is to sort of go around the room and everybody give a little talk about who they are and such. And I don't think that works very well. So I'm going to do this by, kind of a survey, okay? So I know from Larry that a good hunk of you guys are economists. So who are the economists here? Okay, that's what I've kind of figured. But there's a smattering of political scientists and sociologists. Who are the sociologists? Well, okay, and there's the political scientists. So actually, this is a good example of an economist who doesn't have rational expectations. He said it was only about 25%, 75% economists.
Well, we don't have the full sample here.
Okay.
There's selection bias.
And then another thing, and this is I want to talk about. Pardon?
There's some policy people too.
Okay, there's some policy people. But I mean, but everybody, by the way, Chris, everybody in that regard, every discipline, is imperialist in that regard. They claim the policy is in their domain as well. And how many people have any, now this is what I want to think is, this is a harder question to frame, but know anything about crime? Or think they know something a little bit about it? Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is the way, getting into our time together is I have three different presentations here. The first one is a presentation which was developed for a very general audience that I gave in a public setting at a reward ceremony. And it was addressed at, just as I said, when the inevitable happens, rising, not falling crime rates, what to do. And so that's what ostensibly, and so that's a policy, it was a policy, or it is a policy-oriented lecture. But I also want to use this as an opportunity, particularly for those of you who don't know a lot about crime, or just who know some, to just talk about some of the most, what I regard as some of the more important findings from research on crime, which is done by a variety of disciplines, including economists, sociologists, and political scientists. There's a couple, well, I won't get into that has been, so to talk about some of these key findings and along the way make mention at least of some, I think, really important, outstanding research problems beyond the policy perspective. So, oh, and then one other question. Who in this room is under 30? Okay, so a lot of you. Okay, so the reason I asked that question, for those of you who are in that group, and even those of you who aren't under 30, you were probably too young to even remember this, but beginning in the early 1990s, crime rates started declining precipitously in the United States. And I've plotted here, there's a plot here for the US. And what I've done here, and I've normalized everything to the crime rate, in this case the homicide rate, in 1992. So obviously I wanted to do some cross-country comparisons, and homicide rates are very different in the United States versus, in this case, other European countries. But the key point I want to make here is that crimes started declining, and those crime rates, until at least very recently, have persisted for nearly 30 years. My friend and recent collaborator on a project, Rob Sampson, who's a sociologist at Harvard, says that when he the reason I asked the question about, now he's talking about 18-year-olds, is that they have no conception of what New York City, for example, was like in 1990 compared to what it is now. And the decline in crime was a good, important part of it. But what I'm, so there is this decline here. And you'll notice that I've also have 3 European countries where that they were similarly declining, but from different, the United States has much higher homicide rates than any developed country. As an aside, I'll say that our crime rates for other kinds of crimes, it's very hard to do cross-national comparisons for a variety of reasons I don't want to get into. But at this certainly at this point, crime rates in the United States for crimes other than homicide are probably as low, or even maybe in some cases lower, than in Western Europe. So there's been this remarkable decline in crime. And so this was simply a setup to ask the question that was for the opening part of my lecture about what to do when this trend reverses itself. And I'll get to the next slide for that. But now I want to pause and kind of move away and said one of my purposes was to lay on you some very interesting research problems. There's been a boatload of research trying to explain why crime rates have declined so much in the United States. I mean, depending on crime, by way more than 50%, 75%. So this is really a sea change in activity. And the explanations that have been provided as for those of us who are Americans, everybody who's American, for those of us who are Americans, it is reflective of the parochialism in important ways of American research. And they're all looking at distinctly American phenomena. So the kinds of explanations that have been examined are, to what degree has the rise in imprisonment in the United States contributed to this decline? There, for those of you who don't know that, is beginning in the early 1970s. From 1972 up until about 5 years ago, imprisonment rates increased in the United States every year, without exception, and grew by 400%. And the United States has by far the largest prison population. We have 25% of the prisoners in the world. And so one question was, to what degree, and people have said, have contributed to this. Other things, explanations had to do with the role of the economy on the economic improvements. Steve Levitt here at Chicago has argued that abortion, was a contributing factor. There have been a variety of, but they're all about what's happening here in the United States. Yet, the same thing was going on in Western Europe, and I didn't put it on the slide, but in developing countries, developing in Latin America and other parts of the world, were also declining. And nobody, I guess as a logical possibility, the same, thing that each country or each might have its own idiosyncratic, explanations for what's going on, and it just coincidentally they all, resulted in this decline. But I kind of doubt it. And so I think an interesting question here is what's going on here. Another point I want to make is on the next slide. Again, remember the theme of this talk is what's going to happen, how should governments in democratic societies respond to a reversal of this trend? And at least in the United States, there is some evidence of that the crime decline may be reversing. I think it's too early to tell, but there have been very, very sharp increases in homicides, for example, in particular here in Chicago, as an example, and Milwaukee and selected cities around the country. But I will also point out, not in other major places. There's been no increase in crime in New York City, for example, or Los Angeles, but maybe there's a change. But let me use this as a point for step back to a research question, is that the increases in crime, for example, in Chicago, there was a doubling of the homicide rate in Chicago between, was it 15 and 14, or over a one-year period. And this prompted, so it's a very fast and dramatic change, but keep in mind in the last slide that there's been a very dramatic change over a longer period of time, is that none of these, the explanations that have been put forward have been done so in the context of a formal model of crime, and in particular, a model which takes into account the possibility of social interactions, affecting what the equilibrium is. And so particularly in those kinds of models, you can have multiple equilibriums. And a natural question, for example, in Chicago, was there some event which disrupted what had been a relatively low crime equilibrium to a very high crime equilibrium. I mean, and it seems, and well, I could go on at length about this, but I want to move on, in mid-October, Stephen and I are having another workshop which is going to address this I think, really important question of how, in particular, social interactions may be an important explanation or a neglected explanation for what's going on with these crime declines. So, okay. So I began saying, again, remembering, when we go back to the theme of this presentation, was how should governments respond if there's a reversal? And so I began by pointing out that there should be three responses from outside the criminal justice system. Because one thing we do know is that there are differences of opinion about the degree to which the criminal justice system, by that I mean like corrections, prisons, police, and people like that, can affect crime. It's now widely understood that that crime is going on in the context of a much larger set of social forces, and we need to respond accordingly. Get this thing to go. So one point is a topic which you've probably heard earlier this week, but it's a central theme of the human capital, of the institute here, is that there's large amounts of evidence that the developmental origins of antisocial behavior start off very early in life, and therefore that I'm calling early childhood enrichment programs can play an important and powerful role here. I will just make one comment here about this, is that there's a massive literature that's about this topic. It's an area where I've done a lot of research in other ways, and at least now I will direct it here at the Economist, is just coming back from NBER and so forth, is I would say, and this is a common problem with lots of disciplines, including economics. When you hear the economists talk about these kinds of programs, it's striking how little attention they pay to the enormous literature outside of economics, on this problem. And there's a lot to be learned from there. So, but going on. Another is one that we're hearing about a lot, very topically, of addressing the drug-crime nexus. Here is, I'm simply making the point that large fractions of people, for example, who are incarcerated or arrested, in various ways have contact with the criminal justice system, are drug involved. It's particularly high in jails. Again, a distinction in the United States, at least, is we have jails which are for short-term incarceration, usually for less than 2-year sentences, but also the jails hold people who are being held for trial and things. They're local, and then in prisons hold people who have been convicted and have longer sentences. Particularly in jails, but also in prisons, a very high fraction of the prisoners have drug problems. In jails, often over 50%. Yet, an interesting question that I've never seen a satisfactory answer to is, to what degree is drug use a cause of crime? That, I mean, a simple example, to what degree are people stealing, and to what degree of, for example, of property crimes are attributable to people stealing to support their habit? And the reason this is a complicated question is that, that people who commit crime in general tend to have an array of problems, and the question is this kind of just co-occurring, or in what psychologists would call, to what degree is these just comorbid behaviors? I go out, I'm a screw up, and I can't get a job, and I take drugs, and I steal, and it's all going on because I'm a screw up, as opposed to one, causing the other. And there's not, it's striking that to me, that there's not a good answer to, even partial answer to that question. So, but in terms of the policy response, which is very topical these days with the opioid crisis going on, is we do know that treatments of various sorts, can be effective in dealing with people's drug problems. And then another comparably, to me, even more complicated problem is the overlap between criminal involvement and mental illness. An even larger fraction of people who come in contact with the criminal justice system have some kind of diagnosed mental disorder. Now, part of this is related to the prior bullet point, is kind of tautological, because in psychologists, in clinical psychology, if you're drug addicted, it's treated as a mental illness. So there's there's a lot of mental illness here, and again, what effect that is having on, again, getting back to the drug thing, this is even a more complicated and challenging problem, I think, than even trying to sort out the drug-crime nexus in the way I described. Because while there's good, obvious, logical reasons for thinking that why drug addiction would cause you to steal, in the context of the theory here, this is a much more complicated question. And I'll just say that in psychology, people who have studied this is that there is a consensus that extreme mental illness like schizophrenia combined with drug use is kind of the witch's brew for generating violence. So in that direction. But in other ways, this is much more complicated, because things like depression and anxiety and things like that might actually arguably make you less crime prone. So I think that this is still another one. Go ahead. Oh, by the way. Questions?
Yeah, so would you consider alcohol a drug as well?
The answer is yes, it is considered a drug. And an interesting thing is there is a separate literature on the relationship between alcohol use and criminal activity. And what you see is, particularly in the context of homicide, for example, which have been studied in detail, that alcohol is often a present factor in a lot of homicides. But this is a thing of trying to sort out cause and effect relationships is that, some people try to theorize, well, is alcohol, reduces inhibition. So you get mad and your inhibitory controls are down and you strike out and kill somebody, for example, or hit somebody. But also alcohol, dulls, has sedative qualities to it as well, and so that kind of pushes things in the opposite direction. By the way, I just want to say, one thing I neglected to say is if you have questions and want to, please ask. I think you asked.
So it always bothers me a little bit, this drug crime nexus, because, by that, do you mean that drug use would change something in people's mind and would make them more prone to commit crime because of the use of the drug? Or it's like because drugs are expensive and then it's the lack of the money to buy it, or the lack of access to a market, or the combination of it?
Well, those are all good points. Those are all different mechanisms by which you might speculate that drugs cause crime. Okay, one is it causes crime because I'm addicted and I need to steal, to get the money to pay for my drugs. Some drugs can, have this kind of role, not unlike alcohol, which reduces inhibition. So if I'm high, I'm more likely, to strike out in various ways. And then finally, at a larger, going on beyond, individuals, but it's sort of at macro kinds of market structures or macro factors that sociologists would describe them as, is that one of the arguments, for example, for why the crime decline occurred in the US, at least initially, was that when that crime started declining, it was at the height of the crack epidemic in the early 90s in the US. And one argument that was made was that the markets stabilized, and that a lot of this violence was attributable, to competing groups, trying to dominate the marketplace, and that those markets stabilized and reduced crime. So there's lots, as you're pointing out, part of the problem of sorting this all out, and maybe this is why it's not been effectively sorted out, is because there's many possible mechanisms. And I think to make a convincing explanation, you're going to have to focus in on any one of these things and sort of carefully, try to sort it out. Is that?
Yes, and also once I heard someone saying that, so the richer you get or the more educated you get, you get out of you're not target. Right? Like the police doesn't target you, so maybe you are using drugs and you're out of the radar, or you're committing crimes, but what color, type of crimes and everything, and you're using drugs, but right. All these are totally
those are all. Those are all the complexities that you'd have to deal with if you're going to try to answer this. The larger question that I'm dealing with is, and the reason, for example, going back to my very first slide, people commonly use homicide rates as kind of barometer of the amount of crime that's going on, because crimes do tend to be correlated across types, is that homicides are the best documented, crime. And there is no ambiguity whatsoever that there's been a decline in homicides in the United States and all these other countries. Whereas, we could, with regard to drug use and other kinds of crimes, sexual violence and so forth, it's very easy, to make legitimate arguments for why these trends could be very deceptive. Okay, so just watching this. Got to watch the clock. Sure.
I was wondering, to what extent do you think the unique feature of American prison system, the fact that the United States, as far as I know, is the only country that has for-profit prisons, to what extent that factor or characteristic
Is yeah, I'm going to move on, but I'll give you my short answer. You're not the first person to ask that question and ask it clearly in a I don't know how you're asking it, but clearly in a rhetorical way, of arguing that prisons are sort of like it's a version of the military-industrial complex kind of argument. I'm more skeptical of it because the reason, I know that these private prisons have an economic interest in these things, and we heard most recently when Attorney General Sessions sort of said, as part of the Trump administration crackdown, which I'll actually get to in a minute about why I think that's so wrongheaded, of starting to use these prisons. The reason I'm more skeptical of it is that in general, there is the public sector unions for corrections officers and stuff. As close as I can tell, seem to be as strong, politically powerful as private prisons, and you have the same kind of phenomenon of you build a prison, let's say in upstate New York, and it's a major source of jobs there, and then New York State says, well, we want to close that down, and there's you're the political scientist, there's just the expected, political reaction from the political process. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of it, but I could be wrong. About that. Moving on is Cesar Beccaria made, this is one of I think the most important comments about criminal justice policy that every, not only academic, but wish politician would keep in mind. That it's better to prevent crimes than punish them, okay? Just to parse that out is, if you prevent the crime, then there's no social, we avert the social cost of the crime, but we also avert the social costs that attend the punishment of the person who committed the crime. And that person's humanity, at least in my view, counts, as does the humanity. There's collateral consequences to that person's family and so forth. So, two fallacies of the 60s, 70s, and 80s that drove American U.S. prison population, criminal justice policy. One was that prisons are an effective way of preventing crime. Another was, and I'm going to get to this, is that police are impotent to prevent crime, okay? And in the circles that I operate in, that is, if a Venn diagram of, let's say, of economists versus all the other people I interact with, and the part of it where there's no economist is people like the first thing, but don't like the second thing, to hear the second thing. Actually, Steve Durloff and I wrote an article about almost 10 years ago, we saw Imprisonment and Crime, How to Reduce Both, and in which we argued that resources should be moved away from imprisonment, which most of the audience loved, and towards policing, which most of the audience didn't like to hear. So, okay, so let me just go on. To make some points is that, well, I'm mentioning and important conclusions, that that American-style incapacitation is an inefficient and unjust method of crime control. It is, again, is that while there was a lot of rhetoric which is about deterrence and these kinds of things, is that the United States imprisonment policy, even now, but certainly over a 40-year period, was predicated on the idea that putting more and more people in prison was, an effective way of preventing crime. Why is that, not the case? There are a couple of reasons. Is that this is data that Rob Sampson and John Laub, what I'm going to show you, that they've written extensively on, and it's the Gluck data. It's a data set of about 500 individuals who, in the 20s, were placed in a juvenile facility, and then they were subsequently tracked by a husband and wife team, the Glucks, and it's probably the first modern, what I would call modern longitudinal data set that was ever assembled. And they just collected a huge variety of data about the background characteristics of these individuals, and then subsequently tracked their criminal involvement. In this case, their criminal involvement is measured by being arrested. They have arrest records, as you can see, going on up to the 70s. The graphs, the graphs here are showing are based on a statistical method that I developed called group-based trajectory modeling. And without getting into an extended discussion of what that's all about, it's a statistical methodology which is based on something called finite mixture modeling. Anybody? Well, there's something called finite mixture modeling. But conceptually, what it's attempting to do, it's a maximum likelihood method, but conceptually what it's trying to do, or aims to do, is to identify clusters of individuals, groups of individuals, in this case, who are following similar, in this case, age crime profiles, trajectories over time. And so the output of the method is the shape of the trajectories, which are defined by polynomials, in this case, polynomials in age. And then you get the shape of the trajectory and the sizes of them, which are in parentheses, estimate of the population. And the key point that I want to make here is that all of these trajectories are declining in age, which is to say the best cure, nature's best cure for crime is getting old, okay? And one of the results of important consequences of our policies of warehousing more and more people in prisons, particularly, this is unrecognized, particularly for violent crimes, is that we're turning our prisons into old age homes. There's been a marked increase in the median or average age of people in prisons now versus 25 years ago, and interestingly, it's being exacerbated that is, the disproportionality is that currently the current efforts to try to reduce prison populations, which have really had modest impact, are, quote, diverting nonviolent drug offenders who would otherwise serve short terms anyway. And so it's only making prisons more disproportionately, having people who committed more serious crimes and who are getting these very long sentences. And so currently, for example, 10% of US prisoners are serving life sentences. And it's something, in terms of inflow, it's a classic kind of stock and flow problem, because if you look at the flow in of prisoners every year, I'm not sure what the admissions cohorts are, but it's not more than at most a couple percent who are being incarcerated for, have life sentences. But because they're life sentences versus 3-year sentences, it just accumulates in this fashion.
I'm surprised. The low rate chronic and the high rate chronic. So they actually have higher rates in their mid-30s than they do in their mid-20s.
That is true. That's an interest. We could go, Chris. We could get on that. But the key is everybody. Is that just to fill in what Chris is saying is that if you do this, look at these curves aggregated over the entire population. You get what's called the age crime curve, which has driven much of the research in criminology for decades and theorizing about why this is happening. But that peak, getting back to Chris's point, is usually around 18 or 20 years old. And Chris is pointing out that the high rate chronic group, which keep in mind is only estimated to be 3% of the population.
Yeah, but the low rate chronic group is, or the other one, the low rate chronic group is small.
It was 8%. But that's peaking, but that one is peaking a little bit, 22, 25.
No, it's peaking at 34. Oh wait, maybe I'm having trouble telling.
Yeah.
There's one.
I'm not sure. But before we dissect this thing, let me just make the following point is, when I was referring to turning our prisons into old age homes, I was talking about the percentage of the population who are 45 or 50 or older. Okay, and they're all going down.
I want you to tell me that's Tony Soprano or something.
Right. This is another graph of the same, making the same point. So the point is that high rate offenders, getting back to the point I forgot, are a small fraction of total offenders. As we pointed out, that this group of high rate offenders where, if you could somehow, and I'm going to get to this thing, identify them ex ante, it might, setting aside some justice I don't want to set aside, I just don't want to get into that, of the idea of on all kinds of dimensions, the idea of incarcerating people because of their anticipated, future crimes, is whatever that is all about, is that these are a small group of the entire offending population, and thinking that policies like 3 strikes policies, which are these very blunt instruments for identifying, quote, chronic offenders, are going to identify them is just patently is wrong, incorrect. So these are some different studies that document that high rate offenders are a small fraction of the total. Okay, so this is a graph from the so-called pathways study. This is an interesting study. I'll just to take a moment or two to describe it to you because some who might be interested in picking up on it. This data set is now in the public domain. It's publicly available. It wasn't available. It was only recently, and it's comprised of how many people? Close to 2,000 individuals, equally split between coming from Philadelphia, and Mariposa County, where Phoenix is. And they entered the sample as juveniles, and they were all juveniles who committed who committed a crime, and it was deemed serious enough by a prosecutor to get them to allow them to be transferred to adult court. So the idea was that they were trying to get a group of individuals who were, as juveniles, have a high concentration of criminally active individuals, and the reason it was called Pathways to Desistance is they wanted to have this large group of offenders, and they wanted to track them over time and see, how much, what their pattern of criminal involvement was over time. And it's a really, really interesting data set, and they have, and here is the frequency of income-generating offending. And the key point here is I just want to make is that there's a history that the distribution of offending, self-reported offending, is highly skewed. That's the key point of this slide. And can they be identified before the fact? I'm skeptical of that, but that you can ex ante identify these people. But that is an interesting problem these days, particularly in our new world of ML, of asking whether using methods like machine learning methods can identify these groups ex ante. As I said, I'm skeptical that it can be done, but it's certainly worth looking at. But this is also, again, particularly for anybody who's, I was going to say particularly the economists, but they don't have to be an economist to be interested in this because they have very good data in this thing about people committing crimes for the purposes of generating income. And so they have data on how much income they're generating from criminal activities, how much income they're generating from legal activities, and the degree to which they're doing both, over any given reporting period. And I just had a paper come out with some sociologists, criminologists, in which we applied a Markov model in which we were examining transitions between crime and non-crime and how they were associated with being involved with legal income-generating activities. So this is a very interesting data set. Okay. Here's another one, which actually I had dinner last night with Larry Bloom and Steve Durloff and Dan Black, and I mentioned something about this. Let me begin by making a distinction which might be a distinction that's understood by the sociologists, but I doubt by any of the economists. In criminology, there's this strong distinction that's made between what's called specific deterrence, and what specific deterrence means is the reaction to how you react to being punished, how the experience of being punished affects your future behavior. So it's in more of a great thing, it's the treatment effect of punishment. And as the label describes, it's suggesting that the experience of punishment, and this goes back a long way, should have a chastening effect. but there are loads and loads of reason for thinking it could have just the opposite effect, having to with which might come from the stigma that's associated, the social stigma that's associated with being punished, with being, for example, sent to prison, or if you go to prisons, there's arguments that are made that prisons, are schools of crime. There's lots of reason to think that there should be the other effect. And then, and this is an important distinction here, is in criminology, they talk about general deterrence, and that's, I think, it captures the way economists think about deterrence. And it's about how the threat of punishment might, affect your behavior. And so here I'm talking about the evidence of specific deterrence, and about 8 years ago I wrote an article where we reviewed with two other criminologists and sociologists, Frank Cullen, who's a prominent criminologist / sociologist, and at the time one of his graduate students. And we reviewed the evidence on specific deterrence effects, and what we concluded here is that compared to non-custodial sanctions, incarceration has a null or mildly criminogenic impact on future criminal involvement, and then going on to say what we said here. And research that's been done since then, I think only reinforces this conclusion. In the last almost decade or so since this was written, not quite a decade, one of another thing that we said in this study was that this research, by and large, was pretty poorly done, because they weren't taking account of the selection problem that was associated with that the people who were sent to prison tend to be more serious offenders than who had not, and it was hard to know whether the fact that whether you were observing a selection effect or a criminogenic effect. Since then, there's been a lot more work done, using IVs that build off, for example, the random assignment of cases to judges to try to get around this selection problem, and that only reinforces the conclusions there are consistently. I've done a study like that. We found no effect. There's been a number of other studies that find criminogenic effects. I know of no study that finds the chastening effect as well. And so what I was going to say here is that one thing, though, I have not seen examined, surprisingly, is, as I'm going to be talking about in a moment, is there is evidence of a general deterrent effect, and particularly that police can be effective in preventing crime. But before I get to that, I think it's surprising to me, though, that nobody has come up with a model which, on one hand, has the threat of punishment being a deterrent, but that when deterrence fails and people are caught and punished for committing their crimes, that the act of punishing them makes them worse in the sense of being, more criminogenic, and to have sort of a general equilibrium model which would sort of sort out the balancing under what conditions do you get an overall reduction in crime, and under what conditions do you get, because of the criminogenic effect, the punishment being counterproductive in the sense of generating more crime.
Can you give an example of non-custodial sanctions?
Probation.
Would court-ordered drug treatment or something? I guess it's kind of a gray area.
Yes, you're getting me. I could go on at length about this literature. Part of the problem, another problem with the literature, is that the treatment is not well defined. I mean, and your question is probing from study to study the way they define treatment. I mean, effectively, they're not posing it in those terms. Is that you don't have, there's no clarity about, real clarity about, what the alternatives are.
I was almost making, I mean, without talking about what to defend economists a little bit, without talking about what non-custodial sanctions are, it's not clear that that really has all that much content. I mean, if we're saying that, punishing somebody by taking $10 has no advantage versus punishing somebody by taking $10 worth of their stuff, that doesn't mean that there's no. That doesn't mean that there's no effect at all. So that kind of says there exists some other sanction that's better than incarceration. Which is different than.
No, I'm not saying that, Chris. What I'm saying here is that I'm not. This quote should not be interpreted to mean that the threat of incarceration is not a deterrent. Because, at least to me, it undoubtedly is.
Right,
Okay? It's just saying that when that threat fails, for whatever reason, fails to deter the crime, and they get caught, that people are punished for it. And what the evidence suggests is that the treatment effect of the punishment makes them worse. And so you have these countervailing forces going on of the threat deterring, but the treatment making people worse. And getting back to my prior point is, how do they balance out? And I'm surprised that there's no, I know of no model that does that.
Yeah, I mean, what you really want is for criminals to think of prison as this really terrible thing. But in reality, it's this wonderful thing, but you don't tell anybody until they actually get there. You want people to think of prison as a really bad thing to deter crime, but then you don't actually want to implement. You don't actually want to implement it, right? That's in some sense that's what you're saying. You want the threat. The threat of incarceration is good. Actual incarceration is bad, right?
I'll make the following thing: is I don't think. I mean, is the argument that you're making in some European countries? There's it's hard not to be sympathetic that maybe being sent to prison is not this horrible situation. The guy, for example, who the Norwegian person who killed dozens of people. He has his cell. He has his own little gym and a television set and so forth in the whole thing. But I don't think anybody is under any illusion that American prisons are places that you would like to be, or that it's better than, so.
Do we have a comparison between possibly this affecting the United States and maybe a country such as Russia, where I saw a documentary once on Russian prisons, and at least for high offenders, those prisons seem to be set up a whole lot worse than American prisons?
I think, let me sort of, is that there are certainly countries, and I didn't see the Russian documentary, but there are certainly countries in the developing world, like in Latin America and and places in Asia, that the prison conditions are worse than even in some of the prison systems in the U.S., which stand out, like Louisiana and so forth, as being particularly brutal. I don't think it's interesting, to me, I don't think it's an interesting question for at least US prison policy to ask whether should we, if we made our prisons, look, closer to the Russian prisons in the treatment of people. I don't think that's an interesting question. It's not interesting from a policy perspective because we're not going to consciously do that. And I don't actually even think it's interesting from a scientific perspective, because what are you going to learn? Suppose you could make the case that incrementally, that Russian-style prisons are more of a deterrent than US prisons. What have you learned from that as a scientist? I don't think anything. It's just kind of, it's an extension of, I don't mean this, as I'm going to get to, I want to get to some of the papers I've written with economists, so I'm not trying to beat on it, but this idea is, there's on the margin, making it worse will discourage things. Oh, sure, but so suppose you were successful in doing that. Who cares? I mean, it's not as if you've learned. It's not insight. There's no new insight, about human behavior and so forth that comes from that. So that is all the. I mean, but I would acknowledge. I'm going to. I should get to one of these. I'll make this point. The next point I want to make in a little bit later. So we're at 10 o'clock. When do we break? And I've got. Okay. Let me try to get through this because I want to get to some of the. Now let me make, in a way, address your point here. Is I've done a bunch of reviews of the evidence.
So we go to 12:30, so you can
okay.
take a half-hour break.
Right. Yeah. Well, I've done of the reviews of the evidence on the deterrent effect of long sentences. And the conclusion of that is that the incremental deterrent effect of long sentences is small. So on the margin, long sentences like we have here, I should probably underline, highlight long. So this is on the margin for long. There's just no good evidence that the crime prevention effects of those are large or even getting beyond statistical significance, and even if you find something that it can be justified, that the social costs of the extended can be justified. Now, what I do think is an interesting question is, and this gets back to the European comparison, is the Europeans have far, far shorter sentences than in the United States. And a recent study that appeared by a student, by David Rivers and Giovanni, of studying European sentences, they concluded that on the margin, there would be a deterrent effect. There is a deterrent effect of increased sentences, but that's in a different context. I think the reason I think that, and so it was written up in The Economist, and they asked for my comment on it, and I said, sure. I mean, it could be the case. I mean, because they thought it was contradicting, things that I had said. But let me say here, getting back to my earlier comment, this finding, or their finding, I think is important for policy. It's an important, it has important implications, or implications that I think Europeans should consider. But I don't think it's, getting back to my thing, I think it's an important study for that thing. I don't think, is it a study in which you sort of feel like you've gotten some important new insight? No. I mean, getting back to the early thing, but it's certainly very policy relevant.
But do sentences in Europe differ between countries? Or are they all like almost all?
Well, I mean,
I'm from Germany, but I have no.
Right. Okay. The answer is there are differences, across. But in Northern Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, and there are differences across country. And Germany is particularly, I don't want to use. I was going to use the word. They have shorter sentences. I didn't even want to. Didn't want to put a value judgment by using lenient or something. Is that the Germans are particularly. They're on the lowest end of punitiveness. Okay, that's the right word. But the range of differences in Europe, including Southern Europe as well, is the sentences are just. There's so much, there's no comparison between the severity of punishment in the European system versus the US.
Which length do we talk in the US? I mean, like...
Okay. Is the average, I'm trying to think, it's good, it's a very skewed, the median in the US is about 3 years in prisons. The average is higher than that, and because it's a very skewed distribution, and there's also, you get into questions of how do you deal with the lifers and the technical issues. Whereas in Europe, something like in the Netherlands, which I've done, I don't know this specifically for Germany, is well over 90% of the people in prison spend less than a year there. In it, and I would be astonished if it was. I would imagine that the Germans are even less punitive. So there's just very material differences, and it's extraordinarily unusual in Europeans to have life sentences. And indeed, in many countries, they're not even permitted.
So is it that we cannot really learn much from this policy research in other countries, because if we believe the Becker model of crime, then this is only one side, and if outside of the prison the opportunity cost and everything is so different in the United States than in Europe, then there must be a higher threat or higher deterrence threat. I mean, it must be harsher sentences to balance opportunities outside.
I'm not sure. I certainly think, I take the view, just my own judgment is that they're all, that we can learn a lot from studies in other countries. And I don't mean this just sort of like like PC kind of thing. Is that I could sort of hold the position that and this is particularly the case with Europeans, is that the cultural differences are not so great that you can learn people are people, and you can learn from research on them. But I'm not, maybe I'm not answering your question.
No, I was wondering whether, this is just one side, and so if we talk about the threat, the punishment should, the deterring threat of having a harsh punishment, we always need to see that in comparison to what's happening outside.
All I'm saying here, from an economist point of view, is that if you we have this equation, should I commit a crime, and it's a cost benefit. One component of the equation, just to simplify it, is if I commit a crime, the probability of sanction. Let me hold off and so maybe the slides. Let me get on here and get through this. Okay, I think I forgot about this slide. Okay, is that this is the certainty of punishment and deterrence. So the certainty of punishment is if you commit a crime, what's the probability that you'll be sanctioned? And it's a product of a series of conditional probabilities that that align closely with the way the criminal justice system is organized. So you commit a crime, probability of apprehension is mostly about the police, but well, it's mostly about the police. We'll talk about that more. And then probability of conviction given apprehension is mostly about prosecutors. And the probability of imprisonment, for example, or some kind of sanction given that you're apprehended and convicted is a combination of judges and how much discretion judges have and what they can do. So that's the certainty of punishment. And the conventional wisdom is, and this goes back to Beccaria. He actually has a quote where he says this, is that it's the certainty of punishment, not the severity of the ensuing consequences, that is the more effective deterrent. Now, now I will make a comment here. If we put this in the context of the Beccarian model, is there's a component of it that has certainty. Let's say the probability of punishment times the utility or disutility of some amount of punishment. And what I'm saying, and I think what Beccaria was saying, is that in the context of US sanctioning policy, that the increment in disutility that comes from increasing the sanction severity in that equation on the margin is small. Whereas these suggestions that I've made and evidence to support it is that in Europe, for example, where the sanction severity is so much less than the US, that on the margin there, it's material. Okay, that's all I'm saying.
There's distribution on which we find this.
Right, yeah, I mean, in economics terms, that's all. I mean, I'm not saying anything more profound than that, okay? And getting back to, I suspect why Beccaria said the certainty of punishment is more effective than the severity, is that he was writing that in 1750. And if you want to talk about severe punishments, go back, then. Leading on to some of the things I'm going to be talking about after we take our break is that that there is good evidence that the risk of apprehension serves as a deterrent effect. That the perceived threat that if I do this, I'm going to get caught, and then all these bad things might happen to me, is a deterrent. There's no evidence on whether there's a deterrent effect of conviction of this conditional probability. There's simply not any evidence about that. And the evidence does not support the deterrent effect of increasing the probability of imprisonment given apprehension and conviction. And the reason that's important as I get down in these slides is this has led me, let me try to remember. It led me to the conclusion that I've been emphasizing as a revision of the so-called certainty principle, is the certainty of apprehension, not the severity of the ensuing consequences, that is the most effective deterrent. And that is, let me emphasize again, I'll get to it there, is with the caveat that I'm being an egocentric American here, okay? In the sense, because the consequences I have in mind here are the consequences in the US for committing crimes, or in Russia for committing crimes or something like that.
So what you're saying is that the fear of being apprehended, of being like taken by the police is higher. That's the effective thing, and either you're going to be convicted or not. It plays a lower.
I'm going to get into what I meant by this fear of apprehension, but yes, what I'm saying is that what happens after that is not. There's not evidence that it's has effective crime prevention effect.
But if you are, if the police catch you, this probability, like these events are very correlated, right? Like if I get caught by the police, the chance that I will end up convicted is like really high, and then.
The answer is, for serious crimes, the chances of something happening are I can't do it off the top of my head, but they are quite high.
Oh, but not for the small ones.
Pardon?
Not for the smaller ones.
I'm not hearing you.
Not for the smaller.
No.
ones.
Yeah. There's lots of.
There's a lot of
exactly.
crimes. Because, like, for example, in Brazil, there is a very bad prisonal system.
Right.
People, they actually.
It's even worse than Russia.
I don't know, but it's really bad. But so you get caught by the police, and you just stay in prison until you're actually convicted or not. So I wonder how this changes the whole
I mean, I can't do a comparison with Brazil, but it is in the United States. It is not uncommon for that to happen, in the sense that there's lots, particularly for less serious kinds of crimes, like stealing or even a burglary. I mean, but not robbery or rape or murder. It's very commonplace for people to be arrested, and because they can't make bail, they're held through their trial, and then they go to trial, and usually in a plea deal, they'll plead guilty and be sentenced to time served. That happens a lot in the U.S. I don't believe that happens much at all in Europe. But
I'm just curious how the death penalty fits into the literature around deterrence, because advocates against the death penalty will make a case that it clearly doesn't do anything to stop people from murdering, but
right.
I was wondering what evidence we have about deterrence of the death penalty.
We do have evidence on that. I chaired a National Academy of Sciences panel on the deterrent effect of the death penalty, and Stephen Durloff was one of the members of the committee, as was Chuck Mansky and a number of other, James Q. Wilson was a member of as well. And I'll give you a quote, is that our conclusion was, I can't exactly quote it, but what we said was the research was so bad that it was not informative about whether the death penalty increased, decreased, or had no effect on the homicide rate. That was our conclusion. And that was the conclusion. Now, I've been asked about what the implication of it is for there, and because one of the other points that we made, and which is relevant to all our discussions about on the margin, is in writing this report, I realized we collectively realized that how important it was to make clear that this conclusion was on the margin. Okay, is that's the death penalty compared to I forget the words, customary sentences, which in the United States are usually life imprisonment or even life without the possibility of parole. That that this research was not informative about the incremental deterrent effect. And I've been asked many times, given this conclusion, what do I think about the deterrent effect of the death penalty? And I've steadfastly refused to answer in the context of having, chaired the committee where we just made the point that we don't know.
So these three probabilities, how likely is that a criminal is not able to predict the second and the third probability very well, and then we judge that the first one is very important just because it's, I think many criminals might actually overestimate the probability of conviction and imprisonment, and then we put a lot of weight on the first one because it looks like that's very important.
Right. Good question. I think that the answer to this is that there's lots of evidence that people who commit crimes are very present-oriented. They're responding to the immediate situation. Conceivably, in some cases, getting back to my earlier comments about people who are addicted, they're responding to their desire to get money for drugs. And that's this present orientation. Or it's a present orientation in the case of a dispute where violence occurs, is they're responding to the immediate circumstances. And you can frame this as, in economic terms, as hyperbolic discounting, or if you're a psychologist, you can frame it, as the cognitive framing of the. There's lots of different ways you can do it, but they're responding to the here and now. And as I was going to get to is, I think that the reason, police, and there's evidence of the effectiveness of police presence in reducing crimes, is, the idea here is that is who's going to rob a liquor store if there's a cop, standing, in a car idling, in front of the liquor store. So that it creates a very tangible threat. And the people aren't just, that kind of evidence is that people are not being farsighted, in the way that's implied by these downstream consequences. Okay. Let me just. So, to sort of wrap this up is how this, back to the original question of if the crime rate changes, how should we respond? Is that we shouldn't respond by increasing sentence lengths, sending more drug offenders to prison, and we should respond to the strategic mobilization of police to deter crime in the first place so that nobody needs to be arrested and punished. I'm going to talk more about the second one, in some of the papers that more specific papers that I'll be presenting after a break. But it turns out that the first part is prescient, is, here we are. It's like, been there, done that. Now I will be political, is, listening to the current administration saying, we're going to send more people. They're just arguing to do the same thing, which experience has shown doesn't work. It's breathtaking. So I will make my one commentary. So, as a follow-up to this, I recently, I'll close with this, is I wrote an essay called Reinventing American Policing for the 21st century, a 7-point blueprint. And I co-authored this with a criminologist, Cynthia Lum, who's at George Mason University. And what's particularly important about Cynthia was that she was 5 years a cop. She's a former cop for the Baltimore City Police. Much to her, I'm a great admirer of Cynthia. I like her a lot. But when she was a grad student, she was going to write her thesis on policing. And she said to her advisor, how can I write a dissertation on policing when I don't have any experience, being a cop? And so she spent 5 years, being, a cop for Baltimore. And the point that I want to get to, and this is something I'll develop in the next paper that I describe, is that crime prevention, not arrests, is paramount. And I'll explain why that matters. And then the second one is citizen reaction matters. These were the things that guided our blueprint. And actually, I'm going to pick up on that theme in a paper that I wrote with Chuck Mansky, which just appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where we actually talk about the trade-off between crime prevention and citizen reactions. So why don't we take a break now and pick up on those things. Okay. Just by way of background, when I wrote that essay in which I, laid out what I called the revised certainty principle. It's the certainty of apprehension, not the severity of the ensuing consequences. That's the most effective deterrent. I wrote that essay when I was visiting the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City, and got to spend a year there, which was a great experience. It's a good gig, if you have a chance to do it, I highly recommend it. And while I was there, I met Bob Solo. Do people know who Bob is? Okay, maybe a generation. Bob, he's now in his 90s, but he was at MIT, and I think, and in a long history, I've heard several people attribute that Bob and Paul Samuelson were the leading figures in building MIT's economics department into, what is that a fair statement, Chris? Yeah, yeah. Into what it is.
Because he still was one of the most important economists of the 20th century.
Right. Yeah, and Bob is a macroeconomist, and he in 1986 he won the Nobel Prize in economics, and so he read this paper and got interested in it, and it led to this collaboration that I'm going to talk about, and at least for the economists here. This might be something even Chris wants to comment on. You'll see a style of modeling here that's not often, you don't see much anymore in economics, which I happen to think has much to recommend it. Okay, so, and Cynthia Lum, I mentioned to you, I wrote, she's a former cop, and my collaborator who's a criminologist at George Mason. So the purpose of this paper was to join three distinct literatures. One was the literature on deterrence, which I've been talking about, we've talked about. There was also a distinct literature on policing done mostly by criminologists, but also by economists, which show that, in ways that I'll be talking about, that police presence is an effective way of preventing crime. Interestingly, I understand why this is the case with, in the case of criminology, is people were surprisingly silent as to why police presence might prevent crime. And so part of the idea here was to formally link these findings to a deterrence interpretation of it. And then finally, there's a large literature in criminology called environmental criminology or opportunities theory, which consciously focus on how changing the physical environment, like putting locks on doors or putting street lighting out, changes like that in the physical environment can prevent crime. And this literature was also completely atheoretical. And for some, actually it's a story in itself, is that they were purposely atheoretical because these were sociologists, criminologists who were kind of rebelling against the ideas that we had to have these theories of, of why people commit crimes, and then we're going to say we're going to be really practical, and talk about how you can change the physical environment by putting locks on doors and things like that to prevent crime. So we wanted to try to, link those literatures. And so specifically, we pose a mathematical model of the distribution of criminal opportunities and offender decision-making to victimize them, and explore the implications for effective and efficient deployment of the police. So some key ideas that animated this model that was that, as we've already talked about, it's a certainty of apprehension, not the severity of the ensuing consequence. So that's a key deterrent. Police presence matters, and how the police are deployed matters. And here, in the essay, which Bob picked up on, in that the essay where I talked about the revised certainty principle, I made a strong distinction, which you're going to see picked up on, between police operating in a sentinel role. The idea of their presence being there, preventing crimes. The version of it, I'm not going to rob the liquor store because there's a cop out front. So you were deterred by the chances, police presence, and which I'm interpreting as you didn't want to get caught. But the crime never occurred. Okay? And then there's this apprehension agent role of the police. And that's when a crime does occur, and they go out and catch the person who committed it. And usually, despite CSI, whatever city you're talking about, the way people are caught are not with elaborate forensic work and that kind of thing. They're caught because the police arrive there as they're committing the crime, or soon thereafter, or the next door neighbor says, Joe did it, and they go and arrest Joe. And that's what I call the apprehension agent role. And so that's measuring the rate at which they apprehend people after deterrence has failed. And while there's a lot of there is social value to that, to this apprehension agent role, and the social value I see in it, at least in certain circumstances, is somebody committed a crime, and there's social value to bringing them to justice for having committed a crime. But is the success rate the rate at which the term is commonly used, the clearance rate, the rate at which police solve crimes is commonly called. The clearance rate is that, particularly in criminology, but also outside of criminology, including in economics, is that they use that as a measure of apprehension risk. One of the purposes of this model is to clarify why that's a bad measure of apprehension risk, because realize it's only the apprehension risk for the targets that were actually selected. And then, as I talked about it earlier, the target characteristics matter a lot.
I was wondering, is there a world where we don't need police as deterrents? Because it seems almost like a band-aid. Like we went up a level to figure out why people are committing crimes in the first place. Like I don't rob a liquor store because there's cops up front. I don't rob a liquor store because I don't want to rob a liquor store.
That's a really good question. I'll answer it in two ways. I mentioned when I showed you those trajectory models, of age crime curves, is the way I got into that line of research, working. I spent a lot of time working on it because I was asking myself the same question. So why do you have to even deter people in the first place? And it was also picking up on the idea that criminal behavior is rarely an isolated event in somebody's life. It's a reflection of a pattern of conduct problems or problem behaviors that goes back very early in life. And in to portray how old I am, in the early 90s, I'd been doing all this research on deterrence, and I got interested in that question. Actually, it was inspired by a really important paper that Jim wrote about the difference between state dependence and heterogeneity, which got me interested in this, in which we began exploring that question. So I do think it's an important question, but I also would respond to the other part of your question that I think it's, and that was why, by the way, let me just say, I started off the talk, the prior talk by giving you those three things outside the criminal justice system. I think those are really important things. But as a realistic matter, is in any society I know of, we do need a criminal justice system, not just to bring people to justice, but to prevent crime. And there's lots of powerful anecdotes about what happens when there's no police presence. And one of the best I heard of is that a legal scholar, Johann Andreas, does that name mean anything to you? He's long died, but he tells the story of he was in the Second World War. He's Danish, and the Germans invaded Denmark, and at some point they thought decided it was a good idea to arrest the entire Danish police force. And what happened was there was an immediate upswing in street crimes like robberies and so forth, and he made that point, but it wasn't evident to him that there was change in crimes like fraud or something where presence wasn't necessary. And I can give lots of examples of like that. So I think the reality is that I think human beings, in the end, we like things and we strike out when we get angry, and you need something to help prevent us from doing those things.
Perhaps in connection to the point you were just making, is there a difference about the types of crimes that are prevented when police present?
That's a good.
Because with the example of cops standing outside a liquor store, that link is maybe more clear. But is there some idea that crimes like fraud or things that happen like within a home?
That's a very good question. The short answer is that is that what's being measured here, which I'm not going to get into this literature, is crime that's kind of visible externally. So disorder, robberies, those burglaries, but it's not measuring, certainly not measuring, fraud that's going on, behind the scenes someplace, including Wall Street, and it's certainly not measuring domestic violence and things like that. So, okay. Some important target characteristics, that make a thing is, the value of the loot, the risk.
I have a question about the police thing. Is there any evidence that on the, like some dynamics of having or not police? Because I mean, if you take the police off the streets, for example, I imagine that there will be like a repressive crime that will happen. But then maybe the change of the police or the absence of the police can change social norms and can change how people will monitor. Is there any...
Right, that's a very good question. The answer is, and this actually relates to a conversation Chris and I were having before we started, is that all of the evidence that I find convincing, that having police there makes a difference, is only, all of that evidence is over short periods of time. Okay, so, and so the question is, what would happen in the long run, with this continued police presence? Would it be good? Would it be bad? I mean, all of the kinds we don't know the answer to that.
Sorry, maybe it goes in a similar direction. As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, the UK police forces don't carry guns. Is it true? Or like the
it is
Does this have an effect on the like on the different kinds of effects?
The answer, in the UK, some do and some don't. There's a presence of guns. We don't know. I mean, I think that we don't know the answer to that. I think it's clearly contingent. Well, we don't know the answer, but to me, I think that it would have, what impact it has to be contingent upon the availability of guns, weapons in society, in general. And so in Europe, it's much harder, to have certainly handguns, and so people are less likely to be, very much less likely to be armed, and so how I think that certainly that has implications for how the officer is going to respond to, I think, to a violent, a situation. I think one, in terms of what's going on here in the United States and the frequency with which police officers are shooting, citizens, is that while in some instances it's just, it looks to me, it's just cold-blooded murder. I mean, somebody's running away and you shoot them. In other instances, I think it's probably also affected by the officer's uncertainty about whether that person themselves is armed or not, which causes them to be compared to, let's say, their European counterparts when they are carrying guns, whether, how they respond. So answer is I don't know the answer to your question. Okay. So there's lots of different things that define whether something is a good criminal opportunity. This is just a partial list. And the paper that I'm going to be talking about now is our focus is on the apprehension risk as affected, let's say, by target protection and the things I'm going to be talking about. So some observations about apprehension risk. One is that police numbers and how they're used are a key determinant of apprehension risk, and as is the willingness of community members to report crimes and identify perpetrators. And then this point is key, that the probability of apprehension for any particular criminal opportunity is highly dependent on the physical environment and target protection. And so there is a line of research which goes out and asks people, what do you think the chances are if you commit a robbery that you're going to be apprehended? And questions like that. And our key point here is that we make in this paper is that that kind of question is fundamentally ill-posed. And the reason it's an ill-posed question is that if you try to rob the President of the United States, the chances of your getting caught are 1. On the other hand, if you attempt to rob, an elderly woman, on some dark alley here in Chicago, the chances of your being apprehended, if they're not 0, they're damn close to it. Okay, and so is that there's this spectrum of opportunity of probabilities. That's why we think it's ill-posed. So here, is if you have a distribution of the probability of apprehension across all criminal opportunities. And so here we are thinking it's important to think of an opportunity, as some well-defined unit, like a person if I'm going to do a robbery, or a house if I'm going to do a burglary. This model, it becomes more and more abstract if you think about white-collar crime and frauds and so forth. So we're thinking in the context here of having a concrete opportunity, is that we don't know what that distribution is. But in this paper, we build upon this skew left distribution, with the idea being that that most opportunities that from the criminal's perspective, that is, opportunities which have a low apprehension risk, that they're relatively rare compared in the population. And so, in particular, we modeled the district.
I don't know whether to ask this now or not, because maybe I'm taking
Go
it
ahead,
way off
ask.
track. So if I'm thinking about white-collar crime or drinking and driving or something like that, I understand how to think about it this way. But suppose I'm thinking about, dealing heroin on a corner as a profession, 10 blocks from here or something like that. I would think there the probability of being caught at some point is close to 1, and people know that the probability of being caught is close to 1. So is this not a model that we can use to? I think that's true. I don't.
No, it is true.
So is this not a model that we can think about that kind of behavior, or what?
A good question. I didn't. I don't think I tried to actually put this in the set of slides, and because I'm PowerPoint incompetent, I couldn't get in this. Is the way this model is set up? I'm happy to share this paper. It's a static model. So it's not. Your point is true. Is that you have an opportunity, and we sort of have this very simple model. If you're going to victimize this opportunity, if it's, quote, profitable. So it's about it's not a model like you're saying, where you're a dynamic model where you're.
I can think of it as static too. I have two choices. I can either stay in high school, or I can drop out of high school and become a drug dealer.
So I mean, the model, the world. I mean, this is that these are among the different things. The way I hope somebody will pick up on this model, because we did a very basic analysis, and I'll mention, and I think what you're getting at are among the many ways this model could be elaborated on.
Is it fair to think about it more as a model of white-collar crime than a model?
I mean, we can talk about it. As I said it, when we were writing this up, you know, and I was thinking about trying to explain it to criminologists, for which we were completely unsuccessful in doing, is I was writing it in a way I was thinking in terms of, you know, should I rob you? Or should I burglarize this house? And so that's the way I was thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about it that way, and so we could, you know, talk about that. So this is, you know, enter Bob Solo's initial contribution here. He read the paper, and he came down into my office and showed me, you know, this equation, you know, and so forth. And so the way you should think about this is, and the way I want you to think about this is that ceteris paribus, controlling for, specifically holding constant all the other characteristics that might affect your decision to burglarize a home or rob somebody or maybe be a drug dealer. I want to think about that. So like how much money you can make, the severity of the consequences post-arrest, all that stuff held constant. This is the distribution of criminal opportunities. And just to sort of know how this mathematical function works is that as alpha gets bigger, larger, the left-hand tail gets thinner and thinner. Okay? That's I'm going to pick up on that in a minute. And so Bob, being the economist that he is, said, okay, from the perspective of the criminal, which of these targets should I hit? And so we specify here that the equivalent, we call it PA star, the equivalent of a kind of a reservation wage in this model, is that the criminals will hit all targets where the probability of apprehension is less than or equal to P star. And since this is the distribution of criminal opportunities, you know, in the thing, is the crime rate is effectively equal to that shaded area. Everybody?
So just to be clear, there's no differential value to the crimes?
Yeah, that's in the background of this of the paper. We do lay out a simple decision rule. That was why I was saying, you know, where you're going to hit all targets, you know, where the expected profit, where you're balancing off the loot that you could get and the chances of being punished and all that. So all that's being held constant. So we just wanted to focus on probability of apprehension. Is that it?
Yeah, that is good. Yeah.
Okay.
Obviously, if they're all equal, you would start from left to right.
Exactly.
But
so,
if not, then I might.
No, exactly. But we didn't. Yes, that's the point. Is that's why we were talking about the ceteris paribus. So we want to hit all the targets in the lower tail, and so that's the crime rate. And in fact, this is my attempt to put in what, in fact, the crime rate would be in this model. It's whatever P star is, A star is, raised to the alpha plus 1 alpha plus 1 thing. So, some implications for policing. The model has implications for crime prevention well beyond policing, but the policing implications, which I think it has important implications for the effectiveness of targeted versus non-targeted deployment of the police, which we'll talk about. It also has important implications for measuring police effectiveness based on arrest versus crime prevention. The reward structure in a lot of policing focuses on, in various ways, on how many arrests they make versus how much crime they've prevented. And so, implications for non-targeted police deployment strategies. So, examples of non-targeted strategies are, increased random patrol activity, or hiring more police and deploying them in proportion to current distributions of police across the precincts. So it's not effect to target. And then in the paper, we argue that these kinds of diffuse policing strategies are equivalent to increasing alpha. So if we do strategies which have the conceptual equivalent of increasing alpha, what we've done here is, either these two curves, is we've moved probability mass, or we've moved opportunities that the low probability opportunities, we've kind of shifted them to the right, okay? So that's an overall strategy which does that. And then I've shown you that's the reduction in crime from increasing alpha from 2 to 3. And so by moving that probability mass that had previously, that's in the tail, out of the attractive target tail, moving it from here to here, we've been effective in reducing crime. But we're also moving probability mass, which was previously unattractive to criminals, and making it, more unattractive. So it's kind of like, Tiffany's, adding another security guard, to their, to the department store. And they're already so well protected that nobody's going to rob them anyway. That it's that's a wasted increase in those vis-a-vis crime prevention. That was a wasted effort. And then we go on to make the argument that targeted activities are the ones that are more effective. That is, focusing the police where there is crime. One thing I forgot to say at the outset of this is that there's a well-documented empirical regularity that crime, even in high crime neighborhoods, crime is focused at what are so-called crime hotspots. And what I mean by micro places measured at the level of the block face or even the street corner or problem bar, that there are these places where there's just lots and lots of crime and very little crime, in places not too far away. And this doesn't matter, what the overall neighborhood, characteristics are. And so that the idea is, and there's lots of evidence from experiments that if you focus police activity at these crime hotspots, that it's effective in reducing crime and disorder in the ways that I previously described, street crime, at those locations, and not, by the way, displacing it at least beyond there's no evidence of displacement to immediately surrounding areas. And so, so if we could somehow move, in this example, suppose P star was 0.4, and if we could move all of the opportunities between 0.3 and 0.4, all of which are being hit, if we could move the marginal opportunities, that are on the margin from the perspective of the criminal, move them out and make them unattractive, then we'd get that much reduction in crime. So some examples of this targeted approach is what I call is hotspots policing, or something that's called third-party or problem-oriented policing that increases the probability of apprehension through what I call improved guardianship. That is by getting people to put better locks on their doors, improving street lighting, or doing kinds of interventions that close down problem bars and things like that try to, in a targeted way, change characteristics of the environment that are generating crime. So, getting back, that police should be evaluated by their effectiveness in preventing crime, not in their apprehension agent role of making arrests. So let me pick up on what I mean by this. In this model, the clearance rate equals that, the equation that's shown here. So that's the measures among the targets that are hit in that tail. That's the clearance rate measures on average what the chances are of getting caught. So in an integrated sense, it's the average probability conditional that you're in the tail. It's the average probability of apprehension conditional upon the target having a probability of apprehension less than P star. So an example of why, and let me say that is that the clearance rate is often used as a measure of the effectiveness of police effectiveness in their enforcement effectiveness, and it's also used in criminology often as a measure of apprehension risk improperly. So suppose, and this is an example we develop in the paper, is suppose we had an intervention which was successful in moving all of this probability mass outside of the attractiveness zone area. In that case, we would get a crime rate reduction, in this case from 6% of the opportunities being hit. It would go down to a little bit less than 3%. So we're reducing crime, which is a good thing. But the clearance rate also declines from 0.3 to 0.225. And the reason being is now the only thing that's left, which is attractive to the criminals, are opportunities here, which are the ones that are hardest to solve. And so they're the most difficult to solve. And those are the things that the criminals are hitting off. And so the clearance rate has declined as well, even though the police are doing a better job at preventing crime. And so that was an important point that we were trying to make. We also went on and just in terms of model extensions, this model assumed that everybody had the same P star the same kind of reservation wage. And we explored in a variety of ways, allowing for heterogeneity in P-star. And when you do that, without getting into the details, it makes things more fuzzy, but the basic conclusions of the analysis still hold. This was, I won't get into this. So let me use this as an opportunity to talk about, well, next steps with this thing. And maybe this is where we can pick up with, on Chris's observations. I think another really valuable extension to this model beyond the kind of issues we were discussing more broadening out its focus from just on what police are doing is to broaden it out. And I think the most important one would be to make target protection, of making P-star, P of A, the distribution of criminal opportunities, endogenous. And let me elaborate on what I mean by that. Is commonly when people, particularly economists, talk about the contribution, Gary Becker's wrote a paper in 1968 about this, which is it's a seminal contribution. But it's not the reason it's a seminal contribution is not for the reasons that mostly people talk about. Most people talk about the seminal contribution being that Gary Becker posed a model in which people responded to the probability of punishment and the severity of punishment as one part of the model. I mean, that's one equation, short equation in a much longer paper, and which he makes not particularly great note of. And in any event, it was a point that conceptually had been made already 200 years ago by Beccaria and Bentham, that the certainty and severity of punishment are important. What it makes this a seminal contribution was putting in a framework that I would call the supply and demand of criminal opportunities. That of recognizing that target protection and the chances of a target being vulnerable to victimization is endogenous and it depends on the amount of crime. So, targets are a lot better protected here in Chicago than I spent earlier in this week. I was at a place called Chautauqua, and it's this place. It's kind of summer camp for adults to go. It's pretty much, I guess, also summer camp, unfortunately, for only liberal adults, but which was a little annoying at times. And they make this comment: you don't lock your doors, just go out because there's no crime. And that's a reflection of the endogeneity of these things. And I think extending this model in a way that allowed, that treated the quality of criminal opportunities as being endogenous would be a really valuable step forward. And so being able to, therefore, you could still do the kind of policy analysis, actually, that maybe Chris wants to talk more, because you need a structural model of this and being able to talk about the policy implications of changes like targeted policing or whatever in the context of a model which treated these things as endogenous would be, I think, a really valuable thing to do. So that's... And then, given the comments that Chris made, I'm thinking about it in other contexts like drug dealing or something. I haven't thought about it in that way. So,
so you've given us a theoretical foundation for the view that police should be rewarded for effectiveness in preventing crime rather than arrests, and that suggests misaligned incentives, maybe about what's being measured and observed. That immediately reminds me of the medical care system where doctors tend to be compensated, at least in the US, for procedures rather than for delivering better health.
Right.
And that motivates a drive to try to measure health more effectively and what a doctor's contribution is. Do you see opportunities here to measure and thus be able to reward police for preventing crime?
Yeah.
This is a hypothetical thing, right, that doesn't occur.
No. The answer is that is the challenge of coming up with credible methods of measuring their effectiveness in preventing crime. Now, is one way of of doing that, which in some extent has been done in a system called ComStat, which was developed in New York City by Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. How to effectively do it. In the end, it's going to be imperfect, but at least looking at crime before and after is a step forward from where we are. You sort of say, you see a crime hotspot, and you say, do something about it, and if it goes down afterwards, I don't have to tell you guys, why that inference is an imperfect inference, but it's a better inference than what's presently going on, and it's also an important step forward from another thing that this has to do with arrests, is to recognize that 80% of all arrests are for misdemeanors or different kinds of very low-level infractions. Presently, police are rewarded, for making these arrests, and under the theory that this kind of thing of cracking down on disorder is also effective in preventing more serious crime. And there's just no good evidence that kind of approach it works in preventing the more serious crime, but results in enormous social costs to the people who are subject to these arrests. Well, I could go on at length, but about that. Okay. Any other? Okay. So let me, finish this off then.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess I don't bring back what I was saying about before. Is so the word that you might use for some of this is salience, right? So some places, so for a lot of crime, and DUI might be an obvious example. Lots of people will have a couple drinks after dinner. They're technically over the line, but they don't think they're going to get caught, and it's something that doesn't even enter their mind. So that increasing police presence is something that, and increasing the probability of apprehension, particularly the conception of that, seems like it might have a big effect. Mm-hmm. But so for those kinds of crimes, that kind of makes sense. But and again, I don't know very much about this, but if I'm thinking about dealing drugs on the south side of Chicago, I don't think perception. I don't think salience is an issue. Right, I think a police presence is very salient. And is it obvious for that sort of thing? I mean, I'm asking the same question maybe in a little bit different way. It seems like not so obvious in that sort of thing that increasing the police presence isn't going to have much of an effect.
That's good. There have been a number of experiments done. Randomized experiments of so-called hotspots policing, where the focus has been on drug markets. And now preface is that the conclusions remain affirmative, that crime and disorder is reduced. Now, let me get to the more specifically, a more specific version of an answer to your question is, what I don't remember, is specifically what they've measured, okay? I don't know what's being, I can't answer, well, is there less drug dealing? I don't know the answer. I don't remember the studies well enough to know the answer.
We talked about this, but there you might have just pushed it to a different place rather than actually.
Yeah, the answer, is that there was, I think, your question about somebody's question about the long-term effects is we know there's good evidence, and even from a study that was focusing on drug markets, that the crime and disorder is not displaced to immediately adjacent places. In fact, it's reduced, tends to be reduced there over, again, the short term. What we do not know is what happens in the long term and whether it's being pushed to more distant locations, and we don't know what would happen if you did this citywide. Because if you do it citywide, then the implication of this is that if you're going to have more police presence at the hotspots, by implication, you have to have less police presence elsewhere, unless you increase resources. And the question of what you do and how you go about doing that,
I guess at the extreme, I can't be right. So, if we put 10 police at every single corner, and they arrested anybody, anytime you see any time of drug trafficking, you're going to see less drug trafficking.
Right.
So at the extreme, yes, I guess at the extreme, you have to see it.
So I'm going to sort of close out with a paper that I wrote with Chuck Mansky, who's at Northwestern, who's an economist at Northwestern, and which just appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and is, well, that's the title of the paper. So, to give you what motivated this paper, is two key missions of the police, something I articulated, is preventing crime and keeping citizens safe, and building community trust and confidence in the police. This paper was motivated by some observations that as a matter of policy, there appears to be swings in focus on public safety and the trust missions. So post-Ferguson, there was a lot of focus on the trust issue and what you could do to improve community trust. And the recent upswings in homicide in Chicago and elsewhere have moved the focus more back to public safety. And what I think is, and Chuck and I think is the right question is, how can police prevent crime and keep citizens safe without sacrificing community trust? And to put this in perspective is that there's a quote from the essay on Reinventing American Policing with Cynthia Lum, where we said, in difficult times, however, discourse often focuses on one objective with the other receding into the background. In the recent past, the focus has been on citizen confidence, that we're referring to the Ferguson era, and trust in the police. And other times, especially when crime is on the rise and the threat of terrorism looms, the emphasis is on public safety. Then we go on and say, but both objectives are fundamental. And what prompted Chuck and I to write this is that it was the immediate stimulus was that we're both on a National Academy of Sciences panel, which is looking at the impacts of things called proactive policing on a variety of issues. And from the discussions, I can't talk about, the report has not been released, and I really can't talk about the dynamics of the discussions, but I will say this, is that there is a resistance in people who think about using police, the role of police, in a democratic society, to take on the fact that sometimes there are trade-offs that are required between the crime prevention goals and things that may affect, citizen trust. Whereas people don't want to take on these kinds of issues, and I would say a prime example of this is President Obama's. He put together a group to put together a report on 21st century policing, and it was prompted by the events following Ferguson. And the report, the underlying premise of the report is that there's never a conflict between these objectives. The police don't have to, at times, trade them off. That there was that. But we raised the question of, but what about, confrontational policing tactics, such as stop, question, and frisk? Does everybody know what stop, question, and frisk is? And broken windows policing. That was the idea of policing against crime and disorder, either by making lots of misdemeanor arrests, or if not making arrests, when people are congregating on the streets, usually young men, of breaking up, saying, forcing them to disperse. Is there a trade-off between those? And I think that the controversies that surrounded the use of stop, question, and frisk in New York City, and there's a similar controversy that's currently going on in London. They call it stop and search, but it's the equivalent. There's a rash of not only, we hear about the acid attacks in London, but there's also a rash of knife attacks that are going on in London. And there is a lot of controversy, which mirrors the controversy about the use of stop, question, and frisk in New York City, in which the nature of the debate was the people who were behind it, like Mayor Bloomberg, former Mayor Bloomberg, and others who supported it, argued that that it was a necessary tool for reducing crime and effective in reducing crime, and others were just saying, no, it's not, and just emphasizing the social costs. And so what we do in this paper is we put forward a formal model of optimal policing in which we try to examine the social benefits and costs of confrontational policing tactics with a specific focus on the cost to innocent targets of these policing tactics. Well, more about that.
Is there a sense in which tactics like this, though, can be, their legal sanction, like the ability to use these tactics, can provide cover for other kinds of corrupt or discriminatory policing activities?
Yes.
So it's one thing that you could be discriminatory in the process of using substance risk. But there's another way in which.
Absolutely. Let me get to make these points here. There's some related literatures. There's a literature mostly out of economics, but elsewhere as well. There's a racial profiling literature, and that literature mostly focuses on the idea of distinguishing statistical discrimination, differences across groups in their propensity to commit various sorts of crimes, versus taste-based discrimination. So the degree to which, a police officer or some agent of the criminal justice system, is discriminating against blacks because it doesn't like black people. Making that distinction. And so there's that literature. There's a legal literature. The Fourth Amendment is in the U.S. Constitution, has to do with unreasonable searches, and then the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. And so there's a literature, legal literature, on what kinds of, in this case, policing or of things are legal, not violating the Constitution. And so, for example, stop, question, and frisk they're also called Terry stops, and it's after a Supreme Court decision in the 60s called Terry v. Ohio about the circumstances in which police officers had the right to stop, question, and then frisk people, and the legal requirements were that they had I forget the exact words, a reasonable basis, reasonable suspicion that the person was carrying a weapon and/or about to commit a crime. And what do those words mean? Okay, and many have argued that they use that as a pretext, particularly in New York City, for making what are illegal stops. For example, my co-author, Cynthia Lum, she talked about that. She very bothered. She was saying that when she was a cop, she was routinely violating people's rights, by making stops, which just, was just all in a day's work. So getting back to our purpose here was to focus on the optimal use of confrontational tactics that are legal and implemented without racial animus. So we're saying we just want to talk about, bring to the fore that there are trade-offs involved, even if it's being done legally and, as I said, without racial animus. And so the basic features of the model that we focus on proactive policing that uses confrontational tactics that have social costs. There are certain kinds of proactive policing, like working with communities to better secure their property and so forth, which involve interactions with the public, but they're benign. There's no, there's not a social cost, to the interaction. So we were focusing on confrontational tactics that clearly have social costs. Being stopped, questioned, and frisked is not a pleasant thing to have happen to you. And we built from some work that Chuck had done on optimal profiling. And so the basic features of this model are, where we do this cost-benefit analysis, is on one hand, the tactics might have this, the assumption is, in ways that I'm going to describe in a moment, that they're effective in averting crime. So that's a benefit. You reduce crime. But they have costs. And the social cost, there's a social cost to apprehending and punishing lawbreakers, which is, which both of the first two costs are well recognized and understood. But we wanted to specifically single out the social costs of enforcement actions against people who were innocent, who weren't carrying weapons, who weren't intent upon. They were just out there, walking the streets, and all of a sudden the cop, pulls them over and frisks them.
I keep thinking about recent rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration advocating for more confrontation, but kind of post-apprehension. So whether it's seizing more property or and I think there's kind of this perception of oh, if you were apprehended or if you're being prosecuted, you're practically guilty, right? So,
right.
But I'm seeing this as a distinction where you're talking about before apprehend, or in the setting where no one's necessarily going to get apprehended.
Well, there's a lot in what important in what you're saying. In this is that in the case of the SQFs, the stops, question, and frisk, if you look at the New York data, 98% of the people were innocent in the sense that they weren't arrested or they weren't cited for some, violation, of some minor, kind of violation of the law. So in those cases, there are demonstrably large numbers of people who are innocent in that sense. Getting ahead to this, I want to add, but I do want to get to your other point in a moment. So So the basic setup is in this model is there's one type of crime, so there's no variation in type of crime, and there's no spatial component to this model. Okay, and let me focus here on the question about there's only one kind of crime. We're not, if you had more types of crime, you could talk about substitutions across crime types and how much harm they cause. But if you had more than one type of crime, let's say minor crime and serious crime, and this gets back to the broken windows policing, which we don't have, is in the case of broken windows policing, the cops are saying, this person committed a crime. They were carrying, they had some weed, or they were urinating in public, or you name it, and they were guilty. But there are social costs associated with them. So in that case, they're not innocent. Just to keep things simple, individuals commit a single crime or not. As I said, we wanted to we explicitly wanted to look at the impacts across demographic groups. So DI denotes a demographic group. And of course, in the abstract, that can be anything, but usually when we're thinking, just to keep it concrete, is the dimensions, relevant dimensions of demography in this context are age, young people are much more crime prone than old people. Race and sex. Okay. W denotes background characteristics that affect the probability of crime of members of DI in the absence of proactive policing. In the absence of using these, and so those background characteristics could be the level of police presence without confrontational tactics, or it could also be the state of the economy. And that denotes the fractions of persons in group DI who would commit a crime given W in the absence of proactive policing. So getting back to, I think, the earlier comments, rho might be effectively 0 for some demographic groups, like elderly women, and might be quite high for young men or something. So it varies across group. TI measure.
Sorry, for this model, is it more helpful though to think of the kind of crime that a police officer could observe without having to stop someone? So, like for instance, carrying marijuana. If you're not showing it or smoking or something like that, is that the kind of crime we should be thinking of?
No, we should be thinking about like robbery,
okay,
and things like that, because
it's hard to tell who's committing a crime you can't see, but robbery.
Well, you might because of the way the person's behaving, or you see a bulge. They're carrying a weapon is a legal grounds for so you see a bulge for searching somebody. It is not legal by this criteria, and therefore out of the scope of this model, to say, oh, I kind of think you're this young college kid. You're probably carrying some weed, so I'm going to stop you and see if you are. And you might very well do that, but that would not be a legal search. Is that?
That makes sense.
Okay.
It was the statement
even though those are regularly kind of done.
Like elderly women not committing a crime, and I wanted to push on the fact that some groups appear to not commit crimes because there's no investigation.
No, what we're thinking, I mean, in the context of where stop, question, and frisk, is we're thinking about a crime like robbery or burglary. I mean, we're not going to stop, question, and frisk Bernie Madoff because we, suspect that he's engaged in the biggest fraud scheme in human history. TI measures the intensity of proactive enforcement against DI and equals the probability that a member of DI is the target of a proactive enforcement action. And the model assumes that proactive enforcement deters crime, and in the main text we assume that it's linear deterrence. Just to make this point, given the basic model setup, given proactive policing imposes social costs, that's the word. If it wasn't an effective deterrent, then you can just stop there and say we shouldn't do it. Because if it's not preventing crime and just imposing costs, then you don't need a model like this to tell you shouldn't do it. So proactive policing enforcement against a person intending to commit a crime foils that crime. So if I think you're going to, think Trevor's going to, commit a robbery, if I, confront him, then I'm going to prevent that robbery from happening. You could relax that assumption, but it's sort of easier if it foils the crime if it happens, if you actually stop the person. A denotes the social cost of a completed crime. B denotes the social cost of apprehending and punishing an offender whose crime is foiled. And C denotes the social cost of proactive enforcement against an innocent person. And this is what the social cost function is, the form of the social cost function that we want to minimize for each demographic group I.
Earlier you said that maybe it comes from human nature, that something about human nature makes us commit crime. Then why does Roe vary by demographic, or by race, for example? We wouldn't really believe that that's some sort of human nature difference in race, right?
Oh, okay. I mean, sort of is the reason Roe differs by demographic group is because it's factually correct. I mean that in this case, old people, commit far less crime than young people. Young people, let's say murders. I mean, let me sort of think about something that's well measured. Males kill many more people. Like have a murder rate that's an order of magnitude higher than women, and there are differences across racial groups in the rate at which they commit crime.
Wouldn't that indicate that maybe there's a different way to address crime?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, the answer is, but get back. I mean, we are asking. Is remember that Roe measures sort of the background crime rate in the absence of proactive policing. Okay? And we're only asking, on the margin, is it worth, how much proactive confrontational policing we should do? So, and getting back to and my first presentation, it's our focus, you could do the model to do it, to say, well, how about if we reduce Roe? Okay? So our focus is only on confrontational policing. But the implication of this is that, and this has important implications, distributional, I'm just looking at my watch because implications is that the way this works is the optimal solution across the entire society is that for every demographic group, you optimize this function. And for that demographic group, impose, that rate of optimal policing. And so a couple points to make here is what that means is that in principle, some demographic groups might have no confrontational policing against them, elderly women, for example. It's conceivable if you have a, quote, a bad enough or dangerous enough group in terms of Roe that you would enforce against them with probability 1. And then the more interesting in the sense of what we want to talk about, that there's an interior solution defined by that equation where the rate at which the probability of enforcement action is between 0 and 1, and it's defined by that equation. And a couple of, these are fairly elementary points that come from this model, which are surprisingly, even the most elementary points are surprisingly seem to be neglected in debates about these things. One is that optimal intensity declines with C. So the larger the social costs that are associated with enforcement actions against the innocent, the larger that cost, the less you want to use this tactic. And that may seem obvious, but it's surprising to me that, for example, in the debate in New York City about stop, question, and frisk, that nobody ever said, is there some other way that we could do this which would be causing less consternation among the public. Optimal intensity increases with that row point, with the level of crime. More on that in a moment. And optimal intensity, as I've emphasized before, is group dependent. So what are some of the implications of this? That tactics with low cost to the innocent are preferred. I just made the point that there seems to be, even to this most elementary conclusion of this model, there was surprisingly little attention given to this, and it was just a lot of fighting going on saying, where Bloomberg and Bratton were saying, this is vital to, crime prevention, and other people, talking about the social cost, and nobody ever sort of arguing their point of view without saying, is there some other way we could be doing this which would be comparably effective and pose less social cost? Well, that's that. Okay. So another one that is an important point that's made is that policy choices depend on the baseline crime rate. So in the essay that Cynthia and I wrote on reinventing American policing, we wrote, aggressive policing tactics like stop, question, and frisk should target serious crime problems. Unlike zero-tolerance approaches that use arrest for minor offenses indiscriminately, these tactics were specifically tailored to mitigate opportunities for firearm carrying in crime hotspots and have been found to have positive effects. So the point here is getting back to the way the cost function is set up, is that if the base level of crime, rho, is higher, then the benefits in terms of crime prevention of a given percent decline in crime are larger than if it's low. Just a very, so if there are 100 crimes committed and you're successful in doing something that reduces the crime rate by 10%, you've saved 10 crimes. Whereas if the baseline crime rate is only 10, you've only saved 1 crime. And so it's that's the point that we're making here. And to turn back to the earlier discussion I had about the drop in crime, the national decline in crime over the last 30 or 40 years, is saying, so the point here is that what might have been optimal in terms of using confrontational tactics, let's say back in the 90s, when crime was, including in New York, was so much higher, and therefore the potential benefits of crime reduction were so much larger in the sense that I described, they may no longer be optimal in an environment where the crime rate is 75% less. Again, point. And a final point that we wanted to make, that the point of disparate impacts of optimal proactive policing. So as I indicated earlier, is that the way this model is set up is you have differential policies by demographic group. And so you're optimizing this function by demographic group. And part of that function is reducing the amount of crime that's generated by that demographic group. But what that function rho is that's which is measured by how much crime they commit, but it doesn't designate who the victim is. Okay, so even though the model isn't specific, doesn't assume that all crime is committed within demographic group. So an optimal policy can have an effect where members of other demographic groups benefit from the crime reduction of a specific demographic group. So that, again, like the benefits of deterring crime among young men, the beneficiaries, some of the beneficiaries of that may be older people and women. And so the implication of that is that, and as in any policy, is there could be winners and losers. So that even though we're optimizing within by the policy in the way I described, is that some demographic groups may be on net losers in a policy which is overall socially optimal. And so specifically, particularly if you think about, and what, I mean, just to get a sense of this, is what these data are showing here are for New York City, and they're showing the rate at which the attributable risk is measuring the difference in the stop rates between, for example, black males between 18 and 24 versus white males in that age group. And the difference in those stop rates, and on an absolute level, young black men were being stopped close to once a year in New York City during the height of the use of stop, question, and frisk in New York City. And so let's say, assuming that it's so that what that means is that it's probably the case, is that this policy was that young innocent black men who were just out there, they weren't criminals, they weren't doing anything, were being stopped. Question is that as a group, they were very likely net losers in this policy, even if you could argue that it was socially optimal. And so it's not surprising that as a group, they would be particularly disconcerted by this policy. So that was still another a consequence of this. And so getting close to the end, so let me, and I'm losing my voice, let me return to the idea that I think one of these are some ways in which I think further development of the model would be useful. One would be, and I think the most important is the top one, to generalize the model to multiple crime types. And so that way you could, by having multiple crime types, you could differentiate between the social harm that's done by different kinds of crimes, so that a murderer is clearly doing far more social harm than a larceny in general, for example. But you could also importantly distinguish and examine, work through complementarities and substitutions that could go on. So allow for the possibility that a crackdown on robbery might increase the number of burglaries. Or there might be complementarities, given the theory of broken windows policing, that is that reducing, if one crime or minor crimes and the other is serious crimes, allow for those possibility of those kinds of complementarities. But at the same time, taking account of, I think, the underappreciated social costs that are associated with that kind of enforcement actions against these kinds of minor crimes. The spatial dimension is more operational and has to do with where police should be focusing their attention. And then finally, Chuck and I didn't even attempt to calibrate the cost functions. So that was that.
So a question for this model, and maybe also for just standard police practicing in New York or other major places that would do a stop like this. So let's say you're living in a society where only males in a certain age group are the ones who commit the target crime, and your population is 70% black, 30% white. So let's say they commit crime with the same probability. So 70%
across race
are from blacks, 30% from whites. They're equally represented in the population.
Right.
Would a police officer, either in the model or in real life, be able to say, well, 7% are coming from black folks, therefore that should be a target for suspicion? Or should they be saying, well, look, this is the same rate of commission, I should stop and search people equally?
Well, I mean, in this model and all of the racial profiling models is the optimal policy is dependent upon the rate of criminality for wherever you're trying to prevent of the different groups. And so if there's no difference, well, actually I should be. The optimal policy depends upon not only the rate of criminal involvement, like, for example, as I mentioned, the difference in criminal involvement between men and women, for example, at least for violent crimes. But to make matters even sort of tougher to grapple with, at least from an ethical perspective, in these models, the optimal policy also depends on the responsiveness of the group to enforcement actions. If you have a group that's particularly responsive, then in an optimal policy that's going to try to reduce overall social harm, you would direct your attention to that group as well. So well, that's the answer to your question.
I think so, yeah.
I mean,
in the model at least.
I'm talking about in the model. I think that.
I guess I'm trying to figure out also how well the model fits, which isn't to say the model isn't useful. It's more like I think this model makes sense, many aspects of it. And what I'm now trying to figure out is whether I can use this to explain practices in New York policing, for instance, where it seems like there may be disproportionate emphasis.
I think that, okay, there's a couple of things that are going on here. This model is in a tradition of of the optimal social planner. It's a normative model. It's saying, given this objective function, this is what you should do. It doesn't purport to be a positive model of explaining why we're seeing what we're seeing. Okay? That's one distinction I would make is, and the other distinction I would make here, which I think is important, is one of the important virtues of formalizing things in this fashion is I think it serves to make clear what you value and what you think is important. So having laid out this model and you work through the implications of it, I think it's helpful in saying, and you're treating this as an optimal social planner, is to clarify your thinking about what you think is important and valuable on its own. So getting back to my point of saying, if in these kinds of models is that this has a linear deterrence thing in, if you think different groups are differentially deterrable, then when you optimize a model like this, you're going to particularly focus your attention on the groups that are most deterrable, or they're going to get on the margin more attention. So you might stop and say, I don't, wow. I mean, if I'm going to be the optimal social planner, I don't like that. I mean, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Well, good. Well, then I think it forces you to think, well, why do I feel uncomfortable with that? And if I'm going to call this a model where I'm trying to optimize social welfare, if that's making you uncomfortable about its implications, is either to resolve in your own mind, well, that's if you're going to do something that's optimal, this is what you got to do, or you might conclude that there's something about this model or the model you've specified that some important point that you're missing. And the formalization, therefore, is helping you clarify, in this case, a normative sense of what you think is important or not.
I mean, just as a follow-on to that, it seems like what it might be is that there are things that are outside the model, and properly so, because we want a parsimonious model. Something like, for instance, the rate of being convicted by a jury. So if juries are biased against you based on your race, you're probably going to be more influenceable, more easily deterred, right? Because you don't want to get in a situation where you're ever arrested and put to trial. That doesn't seem fair. You're taking a base background bias against people and then using that to justify. I'm not criticizing you.
I know you're not criticizing me. I'm just.
That's an uncomfortable implication that doesn't have to do with either the model being wrong or you not fully dealing with trade-offs. It's sort of like there are background conditions that you might want. Maybe what I'm saying is we should accept some efficiency.
Well, in terms. I'm just saying in terms of the clarity of the of these things is that one question you could have asked. I mean, it would have been, anybody could have asked is, should you have C, the cost to the innocent? Should that, so that's the per unit cost of an enforcement action, against you. It's per individual. And you notice there's no I subscript on that. So it's assuming that as an individual, that the cost of an enforcement action against a little old lady, white lady, is the same as an 18-year-old, black, male. Well, do you think that's, should you treat it as the same? I can make arguments for why you should, and I can also make arguments for why you shouldn't. And particularly, given the legacy, a historical legacy of maltreatment of blacks by the police and the criminal justice system historically in the United States, you might say this is kind of particularly offensive for people who are black. I don't know what the right answer to that question is, even in my own mind, but I would just say that the virtue of having this kind of model in this way, forces you, I think it draws your attention, to asking questions like that.
Thinking about the observability of demographic groups, like obviously you can't, even race, sex, gender, age, you can't identify with perfect certainty, but like you can get that more at a glance than probably other demographics that are more relevant to likelihood of committing crimes. So maybe like whether or not you're employed or whether or not you have kids or
yeah, sure. As I said, you can call this DI. You can define it, I meant that anyway. But the reality is that with regard to policing, the central focus is on race and age, and to a lesser extent, males versus females. But it's mostly about race and age for men. And so we were just framing it in that way because that's the reality of, in this case, of what the controversies about this surround.
When it comes to the cost parameter C, my guess is that would be nearly impossible to estimate whenever it comes to people's preferences for the amount of cost that they're willing to be imposed whenever So would a social choice model possibly help us at, I guess, nailing down, quote unquote, the parameter C in terms of what people are willing to deal with whenever it comes to that extra cost of innocent policing versus not?
I'm not sure what you mean. I will say I don't have any great ideas for how you would measure C in particular. I mean, there's been a lot of work on A and B. I mean, that is the cost of crime and the cost of punishment. But even in the case of the cost of punishment, let me say, I know of no good work whatsoever of taking into account the suffering of the person who's punished, which has a lot of analogies. It's like something like the indignity of being the target of an enforcement action. So I don't have any great ideas on how to measure that, but it's pretty evident just from watching what's going on in our society that C is non-trivial, whatever it is. But you're right. I mean, it makes a big difference of whether you call it. I don't know what the right numbers are, but whatever number it is, if you double it, then it, Thank you.